Good day, everyone. No matter where you are in the world, thank you for joining us today's session on how to outgrow your accessibility partner. As Andrea mentioned, my name is Chaz Steinmetz, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Digital Accessibility at PNC Financial Services. And I hope today's agenda is interesting to you all as it is to me, because I've been living it for the past couple years. But before we do that, I am a white male, brown hair, a short beard. I'm in my home office today, which is filled with Marvel Legos, which was my pandemic hobby that has continued out of it. And today we're going to talk about how to outgrow your accessibility partner. And so our agenda, we're going to talk about how you get started. We're going to talk a bit about corporate culture, technology, supplier management, and how to use knowledge as your multiplier. So let's move on to where we started. And this, when I say where we started, not just me or my organization, but I think it's common of where most of us started, right? There is this huge opportunity of creating a more accessible organization in front of all of you. And it seems like a huge endeavor, right? You know, there's the vision, the strategy, you know, your assistive technology, your suppliers, your customers, your employees, you know, conformance levels, all these things. And it's like, where do I start? Well, you're not alone, right? We've all started there. And I encourage you all to at least start by thinking about your core competencies within yourself, right? Where do you sit in your organization? Are you in technology? Are you in supply chain, compliance, communications, somewhere else? Whatever it may be, I would encourage you to consider how you start from where you are, right? And focusing on how to make a difference within your more narrow world and then growing from there, right? So, you know, me within technology, that very much was starting out in assistive technology, right? And looking at how we can provide a fantastic catalog of tools and hardware and services to make our employees and customers successful. But that may be something different for you, right? Maybe you sit in supply chain and you happen to be the person who does, you know, RFPs, requests for proposals. That might be a much better place to start. So I often recommend you look at kind of where you are in an organization, what your skill sets are as you plot your path forward. But we'll get into some more details on how exactly you can jump in a bit. I like to think, given my background, I'm a bit of a Marvel buff, so I wanted to tie this to the scene from the Thor movies where Thor and Loki do the get help scene, right? Thor is pushing for it because it always works, but Loki has to be a little, you know, humiliated in the process and doesn't want to do it. I think of that sometimes. I mean, this is a bit of a joke just to get the group engaged, but you know, a lot of times when we're starting out, we do need help, right? We need to get help. And so looking to a lot of the fantastic partners out there in the marketplace around accessibility and digital accessibility can really make a difference, right? You may know a bit, but as we've mentioned on the previous slide, there's so much to learn about accessibility and so much work to do and so much difference to make. So it's almost impossible to think that you or a team of people can solve it all on your own. So getting outside help can make a big difference. But today we're talking about how you kind of build your program, build your strategy and vision to make sure that you're in a position to be self-sufficient and self-sustained into the future. You know, we may need help in the short term, but we should always be eyeing the prize of being independent and self-sufficient as we mature our accessibility programs. So do we want to build an accessibility factory, right? So you bring in the help, you're ready to conquer the world. Do we want to build a factory? And when I say factory, I mean like, hey, let's build this fancy accessibility machine that's going to change the world for us. And I would argue the answer is absolutely not, especially if you're in a medium or larger organization. The answer instead is to integrate, right? Take accessibility as a concept and build it into the other practices and processes within your organization, right? depending on how big your organization is, some of these things may or may not exist, but look at like supplier management, or how you train your workforce, or how you manage your customer experience. Don't create this island of accessibility, right? Instead, push accessibility into all these different disciplines through partnerships, through these processes, right? And the whole goal here is, I kind of view it as, when you think about like law, right? Like you can come in and do an executive order to make the world accessible, right? But that can be short-lived and can be easily undone. Instead, you really want to legislate accessibility into kind of the DNA or the constitution of your organization, so that you know if you decide to do something else in your career, or your leadership changes, or the world around you, which is always changing, happens, that you've built this in a way that it can't be undone and can't regress, right? You want this to be a model of self-sustaining, right? So that's the goal here. So we want to take accessibility and push it into everything else your organization already does. In the finance world, as a highly regulated industry, we have processes on processes, right? And if you're in healthcare or another, retail, a lot of those things can remain true. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Instead, how do we partner with these existing processes and teams and parts of the organization and inject accessibility into what we're already doing? So that's what we're going to really focus on today, is ways that you can do that, ways that you can take accessibility and make it a part of what's already happening in your organization. A lot of times when you're starting out too, it might just be you. It might not be your full-time job. We often talk about how to get that leadership buy-in, that team that behind you to get this stuff done. And I'm not going to go into great detail on that today. I know there's other ways to get that information, but instead, let's focus on how you augment yourself or multiply yourself through the existing teams in your organization, and taking accessibility and adding it as a discipline into those groups. So first, I'm going to start with corporate culture. Like I said, we're going to go through culture, technology, supplier management, and then knowledge. But I'm going to start with corporate culture here, and because it makes sense, right? It's kind of the first thing we think of, is how do I build a culture that's thinking about accessibility, thinking about how I make sure that my colleagues have just as much opportunity to succeed as someone else, or our customers, right? Making sure they have a fantastic opportunity to do business with us. And so culture is kind of the first place you want to look. And there's a few different pieces to this. I'm going to go through change, company policy, training, and events. And these are kind of those big ticket items where by integrating accessibility into these, you get the most impact, you get the visibility. And so when you start with change, right, a lot of organizations have change management practices on how you manage change throughout your organization. And so by partnering with the group that does this within your organization, you can make sure that accessibility is thought about, right? So anytime something new comes into your organization, someone needs to ask the question, does this thing have a digital interface, a website or application, mobile app? Does it have a document component, a digital document? And if the answer to either of those things is yes, how do we make sure that accessibility is thought about, right? And pushed down into the requirements of that project or that change. Company policy can be a big part in making sure that happens, right? So most organizations have corporate policies, and yeah, maybe we don't read them all day, every day, but all the controls in your organization are built on those policies, right? And so making sure that accessibility and digital accessibility exists and lives within there and is prescriptive, and what good looks like in your organization is critical, because anything else that you're going to do in your organization can kind of be undone if it's not set in the stone that is your policy, right? So getting things in there like, what is your standard of good? What level of WCAG conformance are you measuring to? What types of issues are you expecting to be resolved? Maybe it's just critical and high to start, because you got to start somewhere, right? And if you put this blanket policy out there that says we're going to be perfect, good luck, right? So it's about managing change in your policy as well. How do you build that 1.0 version of your policy where, yeah, maybe it's not your dream policy, but you have to be realistic that depending on the size of your organization, it can be quite a big ship to turn. And so sometimes you look at, maybe we just focus on critical or serious. Maybe we go after, automated accessibility testing versus manual testing. If you're not familiar with accessibility testing, it's kind of counterintuitive to other testing worlds where, manual testing is kind of the highest level of testing where you can catch as many issues as possible and provide the best experience. Automated testing can be easier to adopt across an organization. So starting there, although maybe not perfect and bulletproof, is a way to show progress and something to iterate upon in the future. Training, right? The next one, we all kind of love training. Sometimes those training courses aren't the most interesting or engaging, right? I think we've all been there, but they serve a purpose. And I think digital accessibility is a topic that can be done in a fun way, and it is a way to start the conversation. Do I think any kind of corporate training is going to be the end all be all of building this culture? No, of course not. But it's one of the pieces in the equation that we need to make sure we're focusing on, making sure that at least people are aware, kind of that 101 level entry into digital accessibility, what it is, why it matters, what's my role in the organization and contributing to it. And I'm going to get into training a little bit deeper, quite a bit deeper actually, in a little bit here. So I'm gonna leave that one there. Events, right? So whether you do, and when I say you, I mean your organization, whether you do external events, if not, you surely do internal events for your workforce, right? So whether that's all hands type meetings or webinars, even external events, how can you make sure that they are accessible, or at least show progress and make them more accessible than they are today, right? That's a great way to build awareness and culture, right? Think about your all hands meetings. Do you have an interpreter there today? Because especially in a large organization, there's surely somebody there who would prefer sign language, right? And sign language is one of those interesting ones because it's kind of a two birds, one stone. You get the obvious benefit of your helping your non-hearing colleagues bring their best self to that meeting. But also, just like here in this session here, we all see the interpreter, right? So we're becoming familiar of just how interpreting works by the nature of being here. And that feeds into the culture, right? So everybody's learning and experiencing what sign language looks like and how it looks inside a meeting. And so making sure that you are partnering with your events teams to make sure your events are accessible is a great way to kind of indirectly push a culture that's mindful of accessibility. And when you sit in all hands and you see an interpreter, you can go back to your own meetings and then you start questioning, should I have an interpreter? Do I need an interpreter? And there's resources we can help to answer those questions that I'll get to later. So let's move on to technology. This is kind of my bread and butter as a technologist, and one that I think is particularly interesting in the world of digital accessibility. Of course, there's a lot to do here, right? And so if you're somebody sitting in a technology organization, or you consider yourself a technologist, these are some of the areas that you may want to start looking at if you're not already. For example, your tools, right? So how do you arm your organization with the tools they need to provide an accessible experience for customers or your workforce? Tools are really the foundation of all of this, right? So you can talk about doing accessibility inside, supply chain management and all these other areas, but it all really comes back to you as an organization need to be able to quantify what good looks like. And testing tools are typically how you're going to do that, right? So making sure that you have a portfolio of tools to kind of meet people where they are. And there's there's still tools that's I'm interested in adopting and using, but you got to start somewhere, right? So something as simple as a browser extension that somebody can load into their browser and be able to test anything is a great place to start, because anyone can use that. A business analyst can use that, a comms person can use that, a an engineer can use that, right? So that's a fantastic place to start and grow from, right? So then looking at how can I get command line tools for my more tech savvy software engineering groups, or color contrast analyzers, or other kind of design tools inside your design systems to allow designers to make more accessible experiences. That one's particularly interesting, right? Because design is usually the first stage. Well, at least in this basic example here, right? Like you design and then you build and you deploy. If you can design it out of the gate to be accessible, you're setting your engineers up for success. So that one's particularly interesting. And then looking at tools for kind of after the fact, your last line of defense. Can you have scanning tools that kind of monitor your environments to make sure that you're moving in the right direction as it relates to your production websites, your things that are live out to customers or your employees. And so I always recommend starting with tools when it comes to technology, because everything else is kind of built on that, right? It's hard to build a program where you're measuring against what, your definition of good, and then you're shifting tools or changing tools underneath you, right? You really got to have those and have those steady to really be able to push a lot of the different parts of accessibility forward. Once you do that, though, you can look at technology change. And so technology changes are some of the most tightly governed things inside larger organizations, right? You have a change management process. You have to get approvals a lot of times to do that. And if you're familiar with processes like that, that there's already a lot of stuff in those releases, right? You got to make sure they're tested. You want to make sure you're deploying secure code, working code that performs against thousands of customers or people using it, right? And so if you have one of these change management processes in your technology group, there's a perfect opportunity to say, hey, why don't we add accessibility testing to that change process so that we can have assurance that regardless of what's happened before the code as it was being built, we're going to say, hey, we need to make sure that this code has been tested for accessibility. And then you can kind of pull the lever of what you allow to promote, right? And once again, this kind of is like policy where it's going to be tough to start doing this and say, we're not allowing any kind of defect to go into production, in the hands of our customers and workforce, right? That can be really difficult. So how do you find that place to start? And maybe it is something like, basic automated testing, getting rid of critical issues, for example, right? And start there. That way your technology teams can become familiar with your testing tools. They can learn, build this muscle of how to do this type of work. And over time, you can enhance that and kind of ratchet that down, if you will, to push yourself further in the right direction. But if you have a technology change process, this is where you want to be, right? You need to make sure that you're getting your tools and your processes in front of your technology change group, because that's kind of the last line of defense as to what makes it into the hands of the people using your products and services. Very similar, you may have, if you're a software engineering organization, you may have, DevOps pipelines. And I apologize to those who in the audience here aren't tech savvy, but bear with me for a moment. When you create code, you promote it into what's called a development pipeline, and that will build your code and run a whole bunch of tests against it, and then ultimately push it into the hands of your customers or employees or whoever's using it. And so similar to technology change processes, you can add accessibility testing into your development pipeline. So that way, as your teams push code, and some of the name your favorites, tech giant out there, right? Like they're pushing code up, daily, even quicker sometimes, right? And so by putting accessibility checks into your development pipeline, you're giving development teams quick feedback, right, on how accessible their code is. And that's great because the quicker they get that feedback, the quicker they can fix it, and the more likely they'll be to push good things to the hands of your customers. You could potentially put gates in there to say, hey, we're not going to allow this code to go forward unless it passes our accessibility criteria. Or you may do it to start as just kind of an observational thing to encourage people to do the right thing. It's all about starting kind of small and iterating, because managing that change across your organization can be quite the challenge. And then document accessibility, right? How do you help your organization make sure that all the documents out there, right, whether it's the person, creating that Word document and saving it as a PDF and uploading it somewhere, or you have a big application that generates documents. How do you tackle that? And that's kind of a space onto its own. I think about how you can turn that into just a service for people in your organization to just consume, because document accessibility is a bit unique, right? If you've ever worked with PDFs before, especially, there's quite the learning curve to make those type of documents accessible. And so if you're looking to kind of maximize your value, it's very difficult to train people across an organization on PDF or document accessibility, because there's so many different types of documents. There's so many different ways to create them. There's so many different ways to save them and export them. And so can you do it? Absolutely, right? And you can go after the big ones, like, how to make your Microsoft Office documents accessible, how to use the tools within those products. You can certainly do those things, but ultimately, I believe you need kind of a service in place in your organization to help people. It could be kind of a consultant-led thing on the front door, right, where you help people. And I think it's always very important to teach them how to fish here, right? This is about the whole sustainability model, right? If I come to you with a PowerPoint document and I'm asking for help, I expect you to coach me through that, right? Give me steps on, hey, here's how you add alt text to the pictures. Here's how you think about reading order in this document, those sorts of things. Very important to do that and create a one-stop shop service where someone doesn't really have to think about, hey, is it this type of document or is it that type of document? How do I just go to one place and say, hey, I have a document and I need help? And then over time, through those consulting, coaching type engagements, people become more self-sufficient. They start checking their documents for accessibility on their own. You're layering training and other types of things to help augment your capacity to train. Documents are a tough one, right? Because there's so many of them and they're so decentralized that it's very tough to govern them. But there's a lot you can do to help people move in the right direction. Let's move on to supplier management. So this is an interesting one, right? Because I don't know an organization that builds everything that they use and expose to their customers themselves, right? We all rely on partner organizations, suppliers, to do all sorts of things, right? You think about like your HR world. There's so many different HR tools for requesting time off or expense management, or even your internal collaboration tools, email or meetings, events like this, right? Most of those things are coming from suppliers. And so it's a little easier to expect your own organization to be accessible because you can kind of control your own destiny and set your own policies. But how do you expect the same from your suppliers? And how do you make that clear up front? Because of course, you can test their products for accessibility, but how do you actually partner with them to make the product more accessible long term? And so there's three main areas here that I think you can do this. The first is your request for proposal or request for information processes. If you're not familiar with these, when an organization wants to potentially consider a supplier for a business problem, you send out what's called an RFP, or request for proposal. And essentially that's a way to kind of vet different suppliers, right? If you have a problem, you may consider, 3 different suppliers, and here's how they compare. And they'll complete, typically a list of questions where you score them, and it's part of your whole exercise of determining which supplier you want to go with. And accessibility should be part of that, right? And so looking at how you add a section to your RFP for accessibility becomes quite important if you're looking to set that expectation up front with your suppliers and actually be able to manage that through potential purchase. You got to do it. I will recommend, because RFPs can be quite long and tedious if you're a supplier sometimes, that you kind of gate those questions, right? Think about where do those accessibility questions make sense? It may only make sense for a supplier that's providing a digital interface of sorts, or digital documents, right? So setting your RFPs up so that you ask that type of, I'll call it a gating question, and then providing accessibility questions based upon how that supplier, that business problem is being evaluated. The next one here is contracts, right? And contracts are kind of where the rubber meets the road in supplier management world, right? You can vet them in RFP. You will most certainly find some form of accessibility defect, right? Because we all know that perfection is a bit of a unicorn, and there's always something to be improved upon, right? And so contract is really where you can hold your suppliers accountable and say, hey, if we expect you to conform to this level of WCAG, for example, and here's how we expect you to resolve issues, right? And a big part of that can sometimes be timelines, right? If it's a critical issue and we report it, we expect it in 30 or 60 or 90 days, right? And you can slide those things however your business sees fit. Sometimes it makes sense to make them a bit more generous out of the gate, because once again, this is all about, you'll never get to 1.0 of like contract if you come out of the gate expecting that they're going to be free of critical and serious and moderate bugs, and they're going to, if you find them, they're going to resolve all of them in a day, right? Like you'll never get that out the door. So you have to start somewhere. And so how you build your contract language to maybe be mindful of that, and be mindful of the fact that not all the world is changing, but it's still not commonplace that suppliers out there are ready to show their VPAT or their whole accessibility strategy or roadmap, at a whim, right? And so that is getting better, but it's still something we see every day, right? And so be mindful that sometimes progress is a conflict of perfection here, right? And so getting a initial version of your contract language together that's maybe a little forgiving as a place to start, I would highly recommend it, right? And then over time you can raise your conformance levels or lower your timelines that you expect issues to be resolved, and go from there. Lastly is ongoing management, right? And so how do you manage your suppliers that are already in the door? Because most likely the pile of suppliers that you already have greatly outweighs the volume of new suppliers coming in the door. And so how do you make sure that if you set up your whole accessibility program, tomorrow, that the supplier you brought in yesterday is eventually, kind of found and kind of caught up, right? Because you certainly don't want them to be grandfathered into being inaccessible. And so if you have an ongoing kind of management process for your suppliers, this is definitely an area that you want to look into, right? You may call it like third-party management or supply chain management, but a lot of times you have a process where, especially like when contracts pop up, your contract's 3 years, that contract pops for reconsideration. Hey, that's a great time to, look at that relationship and make sure that you're adding in that contract language, making sure that you're considering accessibility and the vendor knows that you're considering accessibility. So these are all areas that you can consider. Another one is if you have a public-facing code of conduct, that's a great place to add accessibility language to, so that you have a public presence suppliers, if they're researching, you can see publicly without having to ask any questions that you're paying attention and expecting them to provide accessible solutions. So with all those great ways to look at how to improve the accessibility of the suppliers coming into your organization. But let's talk about my last topic here is knowledge. Whether it's just you, just your team, even if you have a very robust program, it can be impossible to touch all your people and make sure everybody is mindful of accessibility. And so you really have to lean on knowledge as your multiplier, as the title here of the slide suggests. How do you write stuff down and get it out there into the hands of people, so that you can only do so many all hands, you can only present so many times, you can only send so many emails, right? So you have to really build this into your organization. You have to meet people where they are. And so I've broken this down into kind of 3 tiers of how I think about knowledge and training. The first is kind of your tier 1 company-wide training. And then we'll go into tier 2, which is kind of your team-related training, right? Focused content for different types of job roles and things. And then your tier 3 is kind of all the other stuff, your on-demand resources that people can consume. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. This is how I think about it. Hopefully There's some tidbits in here that y'all haven't seen or thought about before. But when it comes to kind of that tier one training, I mentioned it earlier. How do you get the whole organization just engaged at a basic level in the idea of digital accessibility? What is it? What does it mean? How do you how do you relate it to the average person who, maybe isn't thinking about this stuff every day? I think about it in two ways, right? How do you create kind of a fun brand around it, right? Because part of the approach I've taken and seen work is you have so many trainings that are, I speak bluntly here, kind of, stuffy and boring, right? So how can you inject fun into a training course to get people engaged? Another piece of it is disability can often be viewed as kind of taboo or uncomfortable to think about, right? And if you're really going to create a culture focused on creating a more accessible organization, you kind of have to break down that barrier, that feeling of uncomfortableness talking about disability, right? So how can you kind of bring fun to the brand and conversation to get people engaged and a little more comfortable talking about these things? And I think a great place for that is this tier one kind of introductory type training where you can connect with your learner, maybe through some fun examples. We did a similar training and we used the metaphor of, imagine we're all in a meeting together and your headset, I'm assuming for the moment that you're hearing and your headset stops working, right? That's frustrating and you can't collaborate. You're not your best self in your meeting. You feel like you're disrupting the meeting. Most of us have experienced that feeling or at least seen it from somebody else. Using that as kind of a metaphor, a way to connect people to that experience, that frustration you felt when your headset wasn't cooperating, is what somebody with a disability may feel like in almost every meeting they're in, right? If they don't have an interpreter, or visuals aren't being described, or whatever it may be. And so you try to relate to somebody who maybe doesn't have a disability what it feels like and get them engaged on solutions. We used color blindness as a easy example because I think most people have, whether it's correct or not, people have some idea of color blindness and have some understanding of what it is. And so tying that back to very basic workplace things like that RAG, red, amber, green program or project status report, right? Where you just see a bunch of red, green, and yellow boxes, and showing that as a way to say, hey, look, there is easy things, there is easy ways to contribute to making a more accessible organization. Don't use color alone, right? Put some text in those boxes that meet color contrast, of course, to show that report. So focusing this type of training on, like I said, very, very easy to connect the dots, easy to engage and understand ways to get the learner thinking about digital accessibility. But then you can move into your tier two training, as I call it, or maybe your role or team-based training. That's where we can get a little more into the weeds. But once again, when you talk about like hard training, web-based learning courses, there's only so deep that you can go. But nonetheless, there's definitely an opportunity to get more into the weeds into some areas in your organization. Examples that I've included here are your development crews. If you have software engineers and crews building things within code, this is a fantastic one, right? And this is kind of a high impact area. How do you make sure from concept to delivery that accessibility is being considered and solved for? And of course, the earlier in the process that you can make that happen, the better, right? And so making sure, think about all the roles in a development crew. Maybe it's a scrum master, your software engineer, a technical lead, a business systems analyst, even a business or product owner. What role does each one of them have to play in providing a solution that is ultimately accessible, right? Is that creating user stories within your backlog? If you're a scrum master, is that making sure your engineers are using linters and following coding practices for accessibility? Is it making sure your designer is thinking about color contrast? Having dedicated training that really focuses on that group, because that's where your stuff's being built, right? And so making sure that those folks know what good looks like when it comes to accessibility is super important. Supply chain, we've already talked about, right, on the previous side, but having training that really walks them through. You have all your sourcing professionals, perhaps an organization that handle these supplier engagements. You have your business owners that are working with your supply chain folks. How do you make sure that that group of people knows what's expected, how to negotiate a contract, how to negotiate the accessibility language into it, how to score and consider accessibility within the RFP questions, because you have to assume that most of your sourcing world maybe hasn't been exposed to accessibility before, right? So you have to help them learn and figure out how to look at these contracts and RFPs and work with the business owner to make sense of them and make sense of what good looks like. Content creators is an interesting one because you can take this one in a lot of different directions because we all create content for the most part, right? Whether that's even just as simple as sending emails or contributing to meetings. And so this is one that I would argue you can kind of bump up into tier one and potentially give out to your whole organization. It really just depends on your organization and how you operate. But thinking about meeting practices, how do you host or participate in a meeting to make it inclusive and accommodating to all? How do you create an accessible PowerPoint or Word document? How do you use the accessibility checker within these products to quickly resolve issues? What do you need to think about when it comes to videos and including captioning or audio descriptions? Those sorts of things are all prime for your content creator training. Depending on how deep you go, you may target this to your marketing and corporate comms professionals. If you're getting super deep into like social media and videos and podcasts, it may make sense to target that a bit more. But if you're looking at some of the things that we all do, meetings, basic documents, you could argue that is prime for getting out there in front of everybody. And then lastly, once again, depending on your organization and kind of what you do, your support services may be another good idea for a training opportunity, right? Who's supporting your customers? Who's supporting your employees? And do they know best practices on how to support somebody with a disability or different types of disabilities, right? Because how you support somebody and provide a great experience to somebody who's deaf may differ from somebody who's blind, right? And making sure that your staff knows those best practices, and especially on kind of the workforce facing side, if you have an internal IT or service desk, making sure that they're familiar and trained up on assistive technology, right? So how do you support somebody who has a screen reader, for example? That's a very unique piece of technology that, unless you have hands-on experience, is a bit of a black box to you, right? So making sure that you have training available on assistive technology can be a big part of that, like I said, especially on the workforce side. Lastly, here is our tier 3 resources. These are all the other things you may want to consider putting out there. And although these are tier 3, sometimes these become where you start, right? You kind of work up the little tiers here, because a lot of times these tier 3 resources, you or your team can more directly create these and manage these, right? And so they become much easier to manage and get out there. And it's a great place to start learning and see what works and what doesn't work. What platforms within your organization get the eyeballs and which ones don't, right? And every organization is different. So things to consider would be kind of that center of excellence, that single place that people go to learn about all things digital accessibility. Pretty much everything I've talked about so far, right? Where do you go to learn about coding practices or meeting best practices, or how to create documents or use the accessibility features within documents? Putting all those things in one place so that no matter what somebody is building or trying to do, they can come there and learn how to make it happen. In short term, that could be augmented through an accessibility partner for sure. But over time, right, you want to create those on your own, make them your own. What I will say is I'm always in the business of not recreating the wheel, right? And sometimes when you get into the really deep technical things, it may make sense to link out to your accessibility partner or link out to some public facing documents, because part of the constant battle when it comes to these resources is you need to keep them up to date, right? And so that balance of, I want to put my spin on this and kind of relate it to my organization. But when it gets down into the meat of it, you may want to consider referencing to an external source that is being kept up to date, especially when you have a smaller team. Managing documents can be quite challenging. A learning library, right? So accessibility partner can certainly help with this. And this is one of the areas that you may find this just makes sense to do long term, right? Because to recreate the wheel, if you will, of all the different learning resources that are out there from different accessibility partners might not be where you provide value, right? So leveraging those, but ways that you can make them more interesting is by integrating them into like your learning platforms, right? Whatever learning platform you may take to take corporate training or just learning in general, looking at opportunities to bring your accessibility portfolio of learning into that system, right? So that it's out there for all your employees to access, just like any other topic they'd want to learn about, right? You don't want accessibility to be this kind of island of learning, right? You want it to be a part of everything else so people can discover it, engage with it. They don't have to worry about how to get there. They know how to do it. The third one here is coaching services. There's a lot here, right? And you can document things, you can do training, you can do everything we've talked about here, but ultimately, the human touch is very much needed, right? So making sure that you are thinking about how to kind of coach and provide coaching services to your organization. And this is one of those areas too, where you can absolutely look to a outside partner to get you going. But ultimately, I think it makes sense to look at how you insource those services over time. And maybe it's a bit of a ramp, but bringing in different coaches with experience in supply chain or development or even documents is kind of the three basic disciplines that we're covering here today. Making sure you have coaches to help your people through those things. And depending on how big your wallets and budget is, of course, you can get more intimate with your coaches and have coaches engage directly with teams, or you can potentially have them more as a central pool where people can book appointments against or engage with on a more of an on-demand basis. It really just depends on what your organization needs. And then lastly, I put it last here. This was actually, at least for me, the kind of the initial place where I got started as I was starting my journey and my team was starting our journey was assistive technology, right? A lot of times in an organization, people with disabilities think it might find it very difficult and uncomfortable to find what they need to be successful. And it absolutely should not be that way. It should be just as easy to get a screen reader as it should be to get, a new monitor or, your laptop when you start, right? And so a great place to start, if you're coming into this completely cold and you sit in technology, because I'm biased, this is what I did, is provide like a world-class accessibility or assistive technology catalog, right? Round up all of the assistive technology that you may already have scattered in your organization and just write it down, right? That's a fantastic place to start because there's probably stuff already there. You probably already have screen readers out there. You probably already have different pieces of software and ergonomic mice and keyboards and things like that. It's probably not perfect, but it may be out there. And so a very easy place to start is just write those things down. What are they? Who do they help? And how do you get them? And put it somewhere public for all your employees to see so they actually can find and get what they need to be successful. And then over time, you can add to that catalog. You can make things easier to get. You can market them, all those things. But like I said, if you're somebody in technology and you're close to any kind of software, hardware things, this is just a fantastic place to start. And it gives you a place to learn, build relationships, make some mistakes along the way, I'm sure, and then build from there. That brings me to the end where I'm going to hand it back to Andrea and see if we got any questions. But before we do, thank you very much. I hope that you learned a bit as I went through this. You can certainly look me up on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to answer any follow-up questions or help a fellow accessibility champion out there. So over to you, Andrea.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chaz. That was some great content. We had lots of activity in the chat and questions. We are a little short on time, but I think we have time for at least one or two. So I'm going to dive into it. From Sarah, she asks, you have thoughts on how an individual contributor can best start a grassroots effort in an open-minded but maybe not informed company?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Sarah. I would kind of reflect on who you are, where you sit on the organization, what are your current skill sets, right? Because that's where you're going to find the most success out of the gate. Like I said, if you're in supply chain, start asking, hey, who owns the RFP and contract stuff around here? Have you ever talked about adding accessibility things? Or if you're in technology, depending on where you sit, like I said, I started as looking at our assistive technology because I sat in an organization that was close to how we give things to our employees. And so building relationships there. So I really think you got to look at where you are in an organization, what relationships do you have that you can leverage, and look at any of the things that I went through today and figure out which one is kind of closest to you and start there. And another thing to consider too is there's a lot of allies out there in your organization that you don't know about. And so engaging with, if you have like employee resource groups or any kind of group that's focused on disability or accessibility, informally, formally, whatever, getting tied into them, maybe even looking at people who are using assistive technology today, organization, and trying to build relationships there to plot a path forward.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Chaz. I think that's a question a lot of people have. Like, where do I start if I don't have all the resources? Another question that came through from Deanna was just, how would you recommend persuading an organization to have more active trainings versus more passive learning? And do you have any examples of active learning events that have worked well?
I assume when we say like active, you mean like webinar type things versus take a web course.
Yeah, it as opposed to something passive like a learning library course. That's what she put in.
Yeah, I think you can kind of, and what we tried to do in my world was do a bit of both. And so, your corporate training is great because you can require it. Everybody has to take it, but you're right, like it's kind of passive in nature, and everyone's tempted to next through a training course, right? So try to make it in actually engaging is important, right? So instead of just telling somebody, here's what good color contrast is, in the training, actually make them do it or choose the options that are adhering to color contrast. It's an easy one because a lot of times it's common sense, whether you know it or not, like this is not a great color contrast. So you can kind of have them actually do it in the training course. If you can push that level of engagement in your training, that's a fantastic way to do it. If you can't quite do that, because I know sometimes trainings like that are complex or costly, you can look at doing it in kind of in webinar style, right? So instead of preaching inside a webinar, instead make it more interactive by doing things like this, right? Asking people to install a testing tool, a simple one, or a color contrast analyzer, and actually go do it. Teaching the fish is very important to do this right.
Absolutely. I think we're about a minute out. So I guess just any parting comments about, just how to, I guess, promote this throughout an organization. It sounds like you said, start where you know and go look for allies. Any other parting words of wisdom, Chaz?
Yeah, that is where I'd certainly recommend doing it. There's a lot to be done, but you'd be surprised, in my experience, how many people are willing to help, right? I think about my experience, like working in the supply chain world. I didn't know much of anything about supply chain, and if you just go ask questions and ask for help, you'd be amazed sometimes how willing people are to, like, yeah, let's add accessibility to our contract language. What do you think it should look like? Let's draft it. Let's go. And like it just starts happening. And if you are passionate, energetic, relationship management can be a little bit of a useful skill here in the accessibility world. But if you get in front of these people, find them, who owns your contracts, who owns your RFPs, do those things, build those relationships. And sometimes things just start happening and they start working out quicker and better than you ever hoped.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chaz, for a great session. Friendly reminder to everyone that you can continue the conversation in our community Discord.